Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled 10 Days Left for the Planet. 30 years ago in 1988, atmospheric CO2 was just crossing the 350 part per million threshold. The most famous climate scientist in the world, NASA's James Hansen, appeared before Congress on June 23, 1988, and issued dire warnings. Here's how Fox News described it 30 years later. We were warned. On June 23, 1988, a sultry day in Washington, James Hansen told the U.S. Congress and the world that global warming wasn't approaching. It had already arrived. 30 years later, it's clear that Hansen and other doomsayers were right, but the change has been so sweeping that it's easy to lose sight of effects large and small, some obvious, others less conspicuous. Earth is noticeably hotter, the Earth's stormier and more extreme. Polar regions have lost billions of tons of ice. Sea levels have been raised by trillions of gallons of water. Far more wildfires rage. Well, thank you, Fox News, for that apocalyptic story. Now let's look at all those predictions of doom from 1988 and see how they actually fared in the real world, and see if the Fox News story makes any sense. Canberra Times, September 26, 1988. Threat to islands, Maldives. Sea level is threatening to completely cover this Indian Ocean nation of 1,196 small islands within the next 30 years, according to authorities. Wow, 30 years from 1988. That's this year. And there's less than 10 days left in the year. That means the Maldives are going to drown in the next 10 days. And not only are the Maldives going to drown in the next 10 days, but look at this. They're going to run out of water by 1992. And the UN is studying the problem. Well, I was so worried about the Maldives drowning in the next 10 days that I went and checked a webcam to see exactly what's going on over there. Let's have a look at that now. It's pretty frightening. Well, none of those tourists on the beach look particularly frightened. Maybe some noble person should go over there and warn them. None of the 1,196 islands in the Maldives have disappeared. Property values are skyrocketing there, and the Saudis are investing tens of billions of dollars in new infrastructure and airports. I'm guessing that the Maldives aren't actually going to drown. Let's look at some of the other apocalypses predicted for this year. Here's another 1988 forecast from NASA's James Hansen, published by Salon magazine in 2001. While doing research 12 or 13 years ago, I met Jim Hansen, the scientist who in 1988 predicted the greenhouse effect for Congress. I went over to the window with him and looked out on Broadway in New York City and said, "If what you're saying about the greenhouse effect is true, is anything going to look different down there in 20 years?" He looked for a while and was quiet and didn't say anything for a couple seconds. Then he said, "Well, there'll be more traffic." I, of course, thought he didn't hear the question right. Then he explained, "The West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, will be underwater. And there'll be tape across the windows across the street because of high winds, and the same birds won't be there. The trees in the median strip will change." Then he said there'll be more police cars. Why? Well, you know what happens to crime when the heat goes up. Didn't he also say that restaurants would have signs in their windows which read, "Water by request only"? Under the greenhouse effect, extreme weather increases. Depending on where you are in terms of the hydrological cycle, you get more of whatever you're prone to get. New York can get droughts. The droughts can get more severe, and you'll have signs in restaurants saying, "Water by request only." When did he say this will happen? Within 20 or 30 years, and remember we had this conversation in 1988 or 1989. Does he still believe these things? Yes, he still believes everything. I talked to him a few months ago and he said he wouldn't change anything that he said then. So wow, lower Manhattan's going to be underwater in the next 10 days. We better go check the webcam and see what's going on there. Well, lower Manhattan is looking pretty good. I'm doubtful that they're going to drown by the end of the year like James Hansen predicted. Here's another forecast for the year 2018 from James Hansen. Tuesday, June 24th, 2008 by Seth Bornstein. NASA scientist, we're toast. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. So that's between the years 2013 and 2018. So we only got 10 days left for the Arctic to become ice-free. And look at this down at the bottom. Democrats believe that Dr. Hansen is a prophet. Representative Ed Murkey, Democrat Massachusetts committee chairman, said, Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later, we recognize him as a climate prophet. Pretty much the same thing as the Fox News article said. Well, I guess we better go check out what's going on in the Arctic and see if it really is going to be ice-free in 2018 like Hansen predicted. This is today's ice thickness map from the Danish Meteorological Institute. It shows that there's some pretty thick ice covering most of the Arctic basin, 2 to 3 meters thick across most of it. And with the current temperature in Siberia being minus 68 degrees Fahrenheit, it seems to me it's pretty unlikely that the Arctic's going to melt in the next 10 days. I think Hansen might have missed on that prediction a little bit too. There's actually been no trend in Arctic sea ice since Dr. Hansen made that prediction 10 years ago, and the summer minimums haven't gotten any lower. We haven't gotten anywhere close to an ice-free Arctic. So strike 3 for Dr. Hansen. Well, Dr. Hansen didn't do too well with his predictions, so let's rewind backwards 30 years and see what was going on there during the summer of 1988. This is Senator Tim Wirth who organized the hearing with Dr. Hansen. We called the Weather Bureau and found out what historically was the hottest day of the summer. Well, it was June 6th or June 9th or whatever it was. It was actually June 23rd. So we scheduled the hearing that day, and bingo, it was the hottest day on record or close to it. It was stiflingly hot that summer. At the same time, you had this drought all across the country, so the linkage between the Hansen hearing and the drought became very intense. We went in the night before and opened up all the windows in the committee room. I'll admit it, right? So the air conditioning wasn't working inside the room, and so when the hearing occurred, there was not only bliss, which is television cameras in double figures, but it was really hot. So Hansen's giving this testimony. You've got those television cameras back there heating up the room, and the air conditioning in the room didn't appear to work. So it was a perfect collection of events that happened that day with the wonderful Jim Hansen, who was wiping his brow at the witness table and giving this remarkable testimony. So apparently global warming consists of cherry-picking a hot day in Washington, D.C. in the summer, which happens all the time, sabotaging the air conditioning, and putting a bunch of television cameras in the room to heat it up. And that proves global warming. Well, Senator Wirth was correct about one thing. June 23rd, 1988 was by far the hottest June 23rd on record in the United States. This graph shows the percent of stations above 95 degrees at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations. That's about 1,200 stations around the country. And you can see that 1988 was really hot. On June 23, 1988, almost half of the country was above 95 degrees, which blew away all other years. Well, there haven't been any more hot years like that since 1988, and note that the trend is downward. The likelihood of 95-degree weather in the United States has been going down since the 19th century. Also, note that prior to 1960, June 23rd was a very hot day in the United States. The likelihood of 95-degree weather was much higher in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1950s than it has been since 1960. So they had a combination on June 23rd, 1988 of dumb luck. It was extremely hot that day, and they sabotaged the air conditioner, and they had external heat sources heating the place up. I don't really think that has much to do with science, though. This map shows afternoon temperatures across the United States on June 23rd, 1988, the day Dr. Hansen gave his testimony. The red dots show 90-degree temperatures, and you can see that there are 90-degree temperatures in almost every state. And the purple dots show 100-degree temperatures. It was extremely hot that day in the United States. One of the hottest days on record in the United States. Much of the U.S. hasn't had a day over 100 degrees in many years. Hot weather like this is very rare now. And it wasn't just hot on June 23rd in the summer of 1988. The entire summer was very hot. This graph shows the number of summer daily record maximum temperatures set per year in the United States. The vast majority of records were set prior to 1960 and never reached again, particularly look how hot the 1930s were. But 1988 was a notable exception. There were more than 2,000 daily record maximum temperatures set among long-term United States Historical Climatology Network stations. A lot of the heat was due to a massive drought which left soils very dry and allowed afternoon temperatures to shoot way up. In fact, the Mississippi River nearly dried up that summer and left the river mostly unnavigable. Yes, it was very hot and it was very dry during the summer of 1988, and much of Yellowstone Park burned up that summer. Nearly 1 million acres of Yellowstone burned. As much forest burned just in Yellowstone National Park during the summer of 1988 as did across the entire country during this past summer. Fox News claimed in their article that the increase in heat is noticeable, but that simply isn't true. This graph shows the average maximum temperature across the United States over the past century. As you can see, temperatures were much hotter in the United States prior to 1960, particularly in the 1930s and the 1950s, and that average maximum temperatures have declined sharply over the past century. The frequency of hot days in the United States has also plummeted over the past century, and it was much more common to have 90-degree weather prior to 1960 than it is now. Same is true with 95-degree days. As you can see that in 1936, 10% of days in the United States were above 95 degrees, whereas now we're down closer to 4%. And since 1960, the likelihood of 95-degree weather is much lower than it was prior to 1960. Same story with 100-degree days. Fox News claims that you can feel the weather getting hotter simply isn't true. If you live in the United States, you're feeling much less hot weather than people did 80 or 90 years ago. This graph shows the percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit versus the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide. As you can see that as CO2 has increased, the frequency of hot days has decreased, the exact opposite of what climate scientists like James Hansen claim. They've got it exactly backwards. And another very noticeable trend is that summers are getting shorter in the United States. This graph shows the day of year of the first 90-degree day versus atmospheric carbon dioxide. And you can see that as time has progressed, the first day of summer is getting later. And this next graph shows the last day of summer. You can see that it's getting earlier as carbon dioxide has increased. So summers have gotten quite a bit shorter over the past century. Climate scientists, of course, don't want you to know about this because they have a scam going about carbon dioxide causing more heat. And if we look in the National Climate Assessment Summary, you can see that they hid all the temperatures before 1960 because they don't want you to know about the hot weather prior to 1960. But if you dig deep into the National Climate Assessment, you can find this graph which shows exactly what I'm showing. The United States was much hotter prior to 1960. That's why in the summary, which goes out to journalists, they hide all of this really hot data. They don't want you to know about it. And here's another heat wave graph buried deep in the National Climate Assessment, which shows that heat waves were much worse prior to 1960. Once again, they hide all that data in the summary page for policymakers and journalists because they don't want them to know about it, because this completely wrecks the global warming scam. Here's a close-up of the graph from the summary page. They show U.S. heat waves starting in 1960. Makes it look like they're getting worse. And here's the real heat wave graph with all of the very hot weather prior to the 1960s, which they don't want policymakers and journalists to know about. Another very fraudulent graph in the National Climate Assessment shows U.S. wildfires back to 1980. Well, why don't they show data prior to 1980? I'm going to show you. Well, here's the real graph for U.S. burn acreage going back to 1926. You can see that in the 1930s through the 1950s, there was a lot more burn acreage in the United States than there is now. So the National Climate Assessment starts a graph over here around 1980 so that they can show a fake upwards trend, when in fact the real trend is a huge decrease in burn acreage in the United States. They're committing fraud. This isn't science. Let's look at droughts now. James Hansen predicted that droughts were going to get much worse. If we look at the date of his forecast, 1988, the United States was in a very bad drought. But the fact of the matter is that since the 19th century, the U.S. has been getting wetter, and droughts are becoming much less frequent. In fact, 1988 was the last really bad drought we've had in the United States, but they were quite common prior to 1988 when CO2 was below 350 parts per million. As CO2 has increased, droughts have become less common, not more common. One more forecast which Hansen got exactly backwards. One more thing which Hansen said in 1988 which I found particularly amusing was, New York can get droughts. The droughts can get more severe. You'll have signs in restaurants saying water by request only. Well, that doesn't happen anymore, but back in the 1960s it did. I used to go to my grandparents' house on Long Island during the summers in the 1960s, and they had a terrible drought, about 5 years long, and they almost ran out of water. New York and Philadelphia were fighting over the little remaining water in the Delaware River, and New York was within a couple weeks of running out of water completely. Fortunately, they had some rain which broke the drought. I remember this very well because my parents normally didn't allow me to drink soda, but because they wouldn't serve you water in the restaurants, I had to drink it. I thought it was pretty great. Well, New York doesn't get droughts like that anymore, and just like all of his other forecasts, Hansen got it exactly backwards. I find the Fox News story very reminiscent of the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, where people will believe things which make no sense just because authorities keep repeating it over and over again. Most people feel like they don't have the competence or wisdom to question authority, so they just blindly go along with things that they're being told, even though it's obvious that they aren't true. Albert Einstein said, "Blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of the truth." And Richard Feynman said, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts." It's every American's right and responsibility to question authority and look to see if these claims that are being made about global warming and catastrophic climate change actually make any sense. Climate scientists and politicians are trying to push dangerous policies based on this junk science, which will affect you and your children on down the road if we don't get them stopped. I don't own a television and don't get exposed to all the propaganda being pushed by Fox News and all the other networks. Let me show you what I spend my time doing. I spend my time out enjoying the real world. I've been an environmentalist for over 50 years. There is no climate crisis. The challenges which our wildlife faces are due to habitat loss and pollution. We should be spending our time, money, and energy solving real environmental problems, not the fake ones dreamed up by climate scientists who are scamming on billions of dollars in government funding. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.